Women have hit rock bottom. They're trying to turn Valentine's Day into a celebration of single women. The most shocking truth hitting society right now is this: millions of women across the Western world and beyond are facing a future of prolonged solitude because men have permanently stepped back from romantic involvement, leaving traditional holidays like Valentine's Day feeling empty, while women scramble to invent alternatives like Galentine's Day to mask the growing isolation. This is not a temporary phase or a minor cultural shift. It represents a fundamental realignment where men, after decades of perceived imbalance, have chosen solitude and self reliance over relationships that no longer provide mutual value. And the evidence from declining marriage rates, plummeting romantic spending, surging singlehood celebrations among women, and widespread workforce disengagement among men paints a clear picture of consequences that will echo for generations. Stay with me through this entire discussion, because by the end, you will see exactly why this withdrawal is accelerating, how it affects every aspect of modern life, from economics to personal well being, and what it truly means for the path ahead. A reality that many refuse to confront until it becomes unavoidable. The dynamic between men and women in contemporary Western society has deteriorated to a point where genuine partnership feels increasingly rare, replaced by suspicion, high expectations on one side, and calculated disengagement on the other. For years, cultural narratives promoted the idea that men needed to adapt endlessly to evolving standards of behavior, contribution, and emotional availability, often framed as correcting historical imbalances. Yet, as those adaptations accumulated, many men began to perceive the arrangement as one sided, where their efforts in provision, protection, and emotional labor receive diminishing returns in appreciation, stability, or reciprocity. This perception did not emerge overnight. It built gradually through shifts in social expectations, economic pressures, and technological changes that altered how people connect and value one another. The result is a growing cohort of men who have opted out of the traditional dating and relationship marketplace entirely, seeking peace in independence rather than risking ongoing dissatisfaction. Consider the rise of Galentine's Day as a telling symptom of this broader shift. Originally popularized through media as a lighthearted celebration of female friendships, it has evolved in recent years into a more prominent alternative for many women, particularly around February. Reports from major outlets highlight women organizing events, booking venues, and gathering in groups to honor sisterhood on or around February 13th, often explicitly framing it as a way to sidestep the pressures or disappointments associated with romantic Valentine's Day. These gatherings can involve dinners, parties, gift exchanges among friends, or simply shared experiences that emphasize self worth and platonic bonds. While framed positively as empowerment, the underlying motivation frequently ties to the absence of romantic partners willing to participate in traditional gestures. Women describe it as liberating, a chance to celebrate relationships that feel reliable and supportive. Yet the scale of its adoption signals deeper loneliness trends. Surveys indicate that a significant portion of people, especially younger generations, now prefer group or friend focused celebrations over couple centric ones, with restaurant reservations for such events showing notable increases year over year. This pivot did not occur in a vacuum. Economic realities have amplified the sense of disconnection. In the United States, overall Valentine's Day spending has declined sharply in recent cycles, dropping from previous highs as consumers spread budgets across multiple people, including themselves, children, or friends, rather than concentrating on one romantic partner. Data shows average individual spending falling by substantial percentages, reflecting not just inflation, but a deliberate retreat from extravagant romantic displays. Men, in particular, appear less inclined to invest financially in gestures that once symbolized commitment, viewing them as unnecessary when mutual investment feels lacking. Parallel patterns emerge globally. In China, the Qixi festival, akin to Valentine's Day, has transformed into what observers describe as an eerily quiet period, with flower sales plummeting by enormous margins, restaurant occupancy rates collapsing, and social media feeds devoid of the usual displays of gifts or transfers. Businesses that once profited from men funding romantic experiences now face empty counters and unsold inventory, underscoring how widespread this withdrawal has become. Men's disengagement extends far beyond holidays. A substantial number of working age men have reduced or eliminated participation in conventional societal structures, including full time employment in traditional roles. Statistics reveal that prime age male labor force participation has trended downward for decades, with millions neither working nor actively seeking work. Recent figures indicate that around 10% or more in certain age brackets fall into this category, often sustaining themselves through alternative means such as gig work, online ventures, investments, or assistance programs when eligible. Younger men, particularly in the Gen Z range, show elevated rates of joblessness or non participation compared to their female counterparts, who have increasingly moved into stable sectors less vulnerable to automation. This divergence stems from multiple factors, including educational gaps, shifting job demands, and a reevaluation of the costs and benefits of traditional career paths that once served as foundations for family provision. The economic dimension cannot be overstated. When men perceive relationships as entailing disproportionate financial risk without commensurate emotional or practical rewards, they recalculate priorities. High costs of living, stagnant wages in many fields, and the potential for legal or financial entanglements in partnerships amplify this caution. In some cases, men document interactions meticulously, especially in professional settings, to protect against misinterpretations or disputes. This behavior reflects a broader defensive posture where engagement carries perceived hazards that outweigh potential benefits. Women facing rising living expenses and job displacement in certain sectors from technological advances often find themselves in a position of greater vulnerability without the traditional support structures that once existed. The contrast creates a feedback loop. As men withdraw, women experience heightened isolation and economic strain, prompting coping mechanisms like amplified focus on friendships or self celebration. Social media exacerbates these divides. Platforms amplify idealized images of relationships, success, and attractiveness, setting standards that feel unattainable for many. Women encounter endless options in digital spaces, leading to selectivity that sidelines average men, while men consume content that reinforces independence or highlights risks in involvement. The result is a polarization where genuine connections become rarer and superficial interactions dominate. Loneliness statistics reflect this reality, with record highs reported across demographics, though the manifestations differ. Men often retreat inward, finding contentment in solitude or hobbies, while women increasingly vocalize frustration through public expressions or alternative celebrations. This situation traces back to cumulative cultural changes over recent decades. Movements emphasizing independence and self fulfillment encouraged women to prioritize careers, personal growth, and autonomy, often portraying traditional roles as limiting. Masculinity faced scrutiny, with certain traits labeled problematic, creating an environment where men felt devalued for natural inclinations. Over time, these messages accumulated, leading many men to internalize the notion that their presence was optional or burdensome. rather than continue striving in a system that appeared rigged against them. They chose exit. The outcome is visible in declining marriage rates, delayed family formation, and a reevaluation of what constitutes a worthwhile life.
The system is collapsing. Cash will be worthless soon. Crypto is your only escape. Angry's Crypto Academy is linked in the description. Go check it out now.
In China, similar patterns have produced dramatic effects. What was once termed a simp economy, where men routinely invested heavily in romantic pursuits to gain favor, has crumbled amid economic slowdowns. Men, facing high expectations for provision, including housing, gifts, and ceremonies, have often opted out, leading to historic lows in marriage registrations and romantic observances. Industries built around dating expenditures, from luxury goods to matchmaking services, report severe contractions with closures and profit drops in the double digits or more. Women who once relied on such dynamics now confront the absence of that support, heightening anxieties around security and companionship. Back in the West, the parallel is unmistakable. As men prioritize self improvement, financial stability, and personal peace, they avoid entanglements that promise more stress than fulfillment. This choice is not born of bitterness alone, but of rational assessment. Relationships demand time, energy, and resources, and when the return feels uncertain or negative, withdrawal becomes the logical path. Men report greater life satisfaction in solitude, free from constant negotiation or performance expectations. Women, meanwhile, navigate a landscape where romantic prospects diminish. The invention or amplification of events like Valentine's Day serves as a communal response, a way to affirm value through friendship when romantic affirmation wanes. These celebrations can feel empowering in the moment, yet they also highlight the void they aim to fill. Participants often describe relief from relational pressure, but the enthusiasm for such alternatives underscores the scarcity of satisfying partnerships. The broader societal implications are profound. Economies built on dual income households or male provision face adjustments. Industries tied to romance, from jewelry to dining, experience downturns. Social cohesion shifts as fewer people form lasting bonds that lead to families. Loneliness becomes a normalized experience, prompting public health concerns and calls for intervention, though solutions rarely address the root causes of mutual disengagement. This withdrawal represents a quiet revolution. Men have listened to messages telling them their traditional roles were outdated or harmful and responded by stepping away entirely. The peace found in solitude contrasts sharply with the turmoil of mismatched expectations. Women, discovering the practical limits of independence in a high cost world, face a reckoning with the consequences of those same cultural shifts. The consequences of this widespread male withdrawal ripple outward in ways that touch nearly every corner of daily life, starting with the most intimate and moving steadily toward the structural. When large numbers of men choose to remain single and unpartnered, the traditional pathways to family formation slow dramatically. Marriage rates, already trending downward for years, have accelerated their decline in many Western countries, reaching historic lows among younger adults. Fewer weddings mean fewer households forming under one roof, fewer children born within stable two-parent environments, and a gradual reshaping of what society considers normal life stages. People delay or forego milestones that once defined adulthood, not out of youthful rebellion, but because the perceived risks of commitment outweigh the rewards. This delay compounds over time. By the time many individuals reach their 30s or 40s, the pool of potential compatible partners has shrunk. Educational and career divergences have widened gaps in values and lifestyles, and habits of independence have become deeply ingrained, making adjustment to shared living feel foreign or burdensome. Demographers tracking these patterns note that the share of adults who have never married by age 40 has climbed steadily, particularly among men in certain income and education brackets. Women in the same age groups face a parallel reality, though the emotional framing often differs. Where men tend to report contentment with their solitary routines, structured around personal goals, hobbies, fitness, or low stakes social circles, women more frequently express a lingering sense of incompleteness when romantic connection remains elusive. Public discussions around this gap sometimes focus on surface level explanations such as picky standards or unrealistic expectations shaped by media. But the deeper driver lies in mismatched incentives. Men have recalibrated their risk reward calculations after observing patterns in divorce statistics, custody outcomes, financial settlements, and everyday relational dynamics that feel extractive rather than collaborative. The decision to opt out becomes self reinforcing. As fewer men participate actively in dating, the remaining pool becomes more selective or disengaged, which in turn heightens female frustration and prompts further coping strategies. These coping strategies extend well beyond Valentine's Day gatherings. Social media timelines fill with content celebrating solo travel, self purchased luxury items, career milestones framed as personal triumphs over relational disappointment, and affirmations that solitude equals strength. While these messages carry genuine value for many, their ubiquity also reveals an underlying defensiveness, a need to reframe absence as choice rather than circumstance. Influencers and commentators build entire brands around the narrative of thriving without a partner, offering advice on financial independence, emotional self sufficiency, and boundary setting that implicitly acknowledges the scarcity of trustworthy male presence. At the same time, parallel content streams aimed at men emphasize stoicism, skill building, asset accumulation, and the virtues of minimalism in relationships. The two ecosystems rarely intersect meaningfully. Instead, they coexist in separate digital spheres, each reinforcing its audience's worldview and widening the chasm. Economic pressures continue to sharpen these divisions. Housing costs in major urban centers have outpaced wage growth for over a decade, making dual income arrangements almost mandatory for middle class stability in many regions. Yet, when men perceive that entering such arrangements exposes them to disproportionate downside through potential asset division, alimony obligations, or loss of peace, they increasingly choose to remain renters, live with family, or maintain lean lifestyles that require less income. This choice reduces pressure to climb corporate ladders aggressively or pursue high stress professions solely for provision purposes. Many pivot toward remote work, freelance arrangements, or entrepreneurial paths that offer flexibility and autonomy over traditional security. The gig economy, cryptocurrency trading, content creation, and real estate investing have all seen surges in male participation precisely because they allow income generation without the rigid structures that once tied earnings to family support obligations. Women, by contrast, often remain tethered to conventional employment paths that demand consistent presence and long hours, particularly in fields like healthcare, education, and administration, where automation progresses more slowly but burnout runs high. Technological displacement hits certain female dominated sectors harder in the near term, with artificial intelligence streamlining administrative tasks, customer service roles, and even aspects of creative work faster than equivalent male heavy industries like construction, transportation, or heavy manufacturing. The result is a widening disparity in economic resilience. Men who have already minimized lifestyle inflation and built passive income streams find themselves better positioned to weather uncertainty, while women facing stagnant or declining real wages in service oriented roles encounter greater vulnerability when single. This asymmetry fuels resentment on both sides. Men see confirmation that traditional provision roles no longer guarantee appreciation or security, while women experience the practical sting of independence without the promised empowerment. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Cultural institutions reflect and reinforce these shifts. Dating applications, once heralded as democratizing romance, now serve as Exhibit A for mutual disillusionment. Usage statistics show declining engagement among men who describe the experience as time consuming, superficial, and stacked against them through algorithmic biases or mismatched expectations. Women report overwhelming volume but low quality, leading to fatigue and cynicism. The platforms themselves adapt by pivoting toward friend finding, casual meetups, or premium features that promise better matches, yet the core problem persists. People meet less organically in real world settings because suspicion has replaced curiosity. Men avoid initiating conversation in public spaces to sidestep accusations of unwanted attention, while women grow accustomed to fewer approaches and interpret silence as disinterest or hostility rather than caution. Workplace dynamics have changed noticeably as well. Corporate environments that once encouraged casual mingling now operate under heightened awareness of boundaries. Training sessions emphasize appropriate conduct, reporting mechanisms proliferate, and many men adopt a minimalist approach to collegial interaction, limiting exchanges to strictly professional matters. This formality reduces friction, but also erodes the informal networks that historically facilitated friendships and occasionally romances. In some industries, men have quietly shifted toward roles or companies with remote or hybrid models that minimize face to face contact altogether, further insulating them from potential missteps. The cumulative effect is a colder, more transactional atmosphere where human connection atrophies by design. Education systems contribute to the long term divergence. Girls have outperformed boys academically for years, earning higher grades, graduating at higher rates, and dominating enrollment in many university programs. This gap begins early and persists, creating cohorts where women enter adulthood with stronger credentials and career trajectories, while men lag behind or opt for alternative routes such as trade schools, entrepreneurship, or immediate workforce entry. The disparity influences partner selection profoundly. Women often seek equals or superiors in status and earning potential, narrowing their pool as men fall behind or withdraw from competition. Men, aware of this preference, sometimes disengage from environments where credentials determine value, choosing instead paths that prioritize personal freedom over social signaling. Family structures evolve in response. Single parent households, most commonly led by mothers, increase in prevalence, placing greater strain on public resources and individual resilience. Grandparents, extended kin, and community networks absorb some of the load. Yet the absence of consistent paternal involvement correlates with measurable challenges in child outcomes across behavioral, academic, and emotional domains. Society grapples with these realities through policy debates around support programs, shared parenting reforms, and incentives for family stability. But underlying cultural attitudes remain polarized. One side emphasizes systemic barriers and historical inequities, while the other highlights personal agency and the cumulative impact of messaging that devalued male roles. The psychological toll manifests differently across genders, but remains significant for both. Chronic loneliness correlates with elevated risks for depression, anxiety, substance use, and physical health decline. Men who embrace solitude often report short term improvements in mental clarity and life satisfaction, crediting the removal of relational stress. Over longer horizons, however, isolation can erode social skills and increase vulnerability during crises. Women facing prolonged singlehood sometimes channel energy into friendships, career ambition, or activism. Yet surveys consistently show higher reported dissatisfaction with romantic life among single women compared to single men in the same age brackets. The gap suggests that while both groups experience solitude, the emotional weighting differs, with women more likely to internalize it as personal failure and men more likely to frame it as rational self protection. Media portrayals amplify these perceptions. Popular entertainment increasingly depicts men as either bumbling sidekicks, villains, or optional accessories rather than central, admirable figures in relational narratives. Female leads thrive independently or in female centric ensembles, reinforcing the cultural script that fulfillment lies outside partnership. Male targeted content, meanwhile, celebrates bachelor lifestyles, skill mastery, and brotherhood over romance. Both streams reduce the perceived necessity of cross gender collaboration, normalizing separation as the default state. Globalization spreads these trends beyond Western borders. In East Asia, South Korea, and Japan already exhibit extreme versions of male disengagement, with record low birth rates, soaring singlehood, and industries struggling to adapt to shrinking consumer bases built around coupledom. Young men embrace minimalist living, virtual companionship, and avoidance of marriage pressures, while women delay or abandon family plans amid career demands and societal judgment. Similar currents appear in parts of Europe where cohabitation without marriage rises, but overall partnership formation declines. Even in traditionally family oriented cultures, urban youth adopt Western influenced attitudes toward independence, accelerating the shift. The financial services sector feels the impact acutely. Wedding related spending, honeymoon travel, and joint account products lose market share as fewer couples form. Insurers adjust actuarial models to account for longer single lifespans and different risk profiles. Retailers pivot from couple oriented marketing to self gifting and experiential purchases. Real estate markets in some regions soften as demand for smaller, individual friendly units grows while family sized homes linger on the market. These adjustments occur gradually, yet their cumulative weight reshapes entire industries. Public discourse struggles to name the phenomenon without descending into blame. Terms like male decline, female hypergamy, or societal collapse circulate in niche communities, often carrying more heat than light. Mainstream outlets tend to frame the issue through lenses of economic anxiety, mental health crises, or evolving gender norms, avoiding direct causal links to cultural messaging or incentive structures. The reluctance to confront root dynamics leaves many feeling unheard, further entrenching polarization. Yet evidence continues to accumulate. Birth rates fall below replacement levels across developed nations, prompting immigration debates and policy experiments aimed at reversing trends. Governments offer baby bonuses, extended parental leave, and housing subsidies, yet participation remains low when underlying trust deficits persist. People hesitate to bring children into arrangements they view as unstable or inequitable, regardless of financial incentives. This moment represents more than a dating slump. It marks a civilizational inflection point where foundational assumptions about mutual dependence give way to radical self reliance. Men have internalized the lesson that their value was conditional and responded by making themselves unconditionally independent. Women discover the limits of autonomy in a world that still demands cooperation for certain forms of security and companionship. The resulting equilibrium feels uncomfortable to many, yet it persists because neither side sees sufficient reason to re engage on the previous terms. The path forward remains uncertain. Some predict adaptation through new social technologies, revised expectations, or cultural course corrections. Others foresee deepening fragmentation, with society reorganizing around individual rather than collective units. What seems clear is that the old models no longer hold persuasive power for a growing share of the population. Men have found peace in withdrawal. Women have invented rituals to affirm their worth amid absence. Both groups navigate a landscape forever altered by the simple collective decision to stop playing a game that stopped feeling fair. The scale of this transformation becomes even more apparent when examining how everyday social rituals and institutions are quietly adapting or eroding in response to the growing detachment between men and women. Community events that once served as natural meeting grounds, neighborhood block parties, local sports leagues, volunteer organizations, church socials, hobbyist meetups, have seen measurable declines in mixed gender participation over the past decade. Organizers report smaller turnouts, more segregated attendance patterns, and a noticeable drop in spontaneous mingling that used to characterize these gatherings. Men cite scheduling conflicts, fatigue from work, or simply a preference for low pressure alternatives like online gaming sessions or solo outdoor activities. Women, when attending, often arrive in groups of female friends, creating visible clusters that unintentionally signal closed circles rather than open invitations. The result is a subtle but persistent chill in environments that historically fostered organic connections, leaving fewer pathways for relationships to form outside of deliberate high stakes digital pursuits. This erosion extends into higher stakes social arenas such as professional networking events, industry conferences, and after work functions. What used to be opportunities for career advancement through casual conversation now carry an undercurrent of caution for many men. Stories circulate of misinterpreted compliments, offhand remarks taken out of context, or even formal complaints arising from interactions that felt innocuous in the moment. The precautionary response is straightforward: limit small talk, avoid one on one conversations, depart early, or skip the event entirely. Networking increasingly migrates to structured, recorded formats: LinkedIn messages, virtual panels, email threads, where every word can be reviewed and where ambiguity carries less risk. The trade off is clear. Professional relationships become more transactional and less human. Innovation that once flowed from serendipitous hallway chats slows, and mentorship patterns shift toward same gender pairings or purely formal arrangements. Friendship circles themselves have polarized along gender lines in ways that were less pronounced a generation ago. Men increasingly maintain tight knit groups centered on shared interests: fitness, gaming, investing, automotive projects, outdoor pursuits, where emotional support exists but remains understated and practical rather than expressive. These circles provide camaraderie without the vulnerability that many associate with mixed gender dynamics. Women, meanwhile, lean heavily into female centric support networks that emphasize validation, shared experiences of frustration, and collective problem solving around dating disappointments or career hurdles. Cross-gender friendships, once common bridges between worlds, have become rarer as suspicion grows on both sides. Men worry about being misread as having ulterior motives. Women worry about investing emotional energy in connections that lead nowhere. The outcome is two parallel social ecosystems that rarely overlap meaningfully, reducing the everyday friction that once sparked attraction or partnership. Demographic forecasts paint a stark picture of where these trends lead over the coming decades. Projections from statistical agencies in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and several European nations consistently show continued declines in marriage rates, household formation, and fertility well below replacement levels. By mid century, a significant portion of the adult population in these countries is expected to live alone or in non traditional arrangements, with single person households already outnumbering family households in many urban centers. This shift carries profound implications for housing demand, tax bases, pension systems, healthcare utilization, and even electoral politics as voting patterns among never married adults diverge from those of married parents. Governments experiment with incentives, tax credits for couples, subsidized childcare, extended maternity and paternity leave, but uptake remains modest when foundational trust in partnership remains low. The housing market offers one of the clearest barometers of these changes. Developers in major cities report surging demand for micro apartments, studio conversions, and co living spaces designed for single occupants who prioritize location, amenities, and minimal maintenance over square footage. Larger family oriented homes in suburban areas sit longer on the market, with price growth lagging in regions where young adults delay or forego family formation. Real estate analysts note that buyer profiles have shifted noticeably. More cash purchases from individuals building personal wealth rather than joint mortgages from couples pooling resources. Rental markets reflect similar patterns, with landlords adjusting lease terms and amenities to appeal to solo tenants who value flexibility over long term stability. The built environment itself begins to mirror the social reality of widespread singleness, reinforcing the cycle by making independent living easier and more normalized. Consumer behavior follows suit. Brands that once marketed heavily to couples, jewelry retailers, romantic getaway packages, couple oriented fitness programs, shared subscription services, pivot toward individual empowerment narratives. Advertising campaigns highlight self purchase luxury watches, solo adventures, personal finance tools, and home setups optimized for one. The shift is not merely cosmetic. Sales data show double digit growth in categories tied to solitary enjoyment, high end headphones, premium gaming equipment, home gym installations, meal delivery services portioned for one, while couple centric categories stagnate or contract. Retailers and e commerce platforms refine algorithms to recommend products based on single occupant lifestyles, further embedding independence into the fabric of commerce. Entertainment industries adapt in parallel ways. Streaming services expand libraries of content celebrating solo protagonists who conquer challenges without romantic subplots, or ensembles that thrive through platonic bonds. Dating shows decline in popularity or rebrand as friend finding formats, while reality programming increasingly features individuals pursuing personal transformation absent partner drama. Music charts reflect the mood. Lyrics about heartbreak give way to anthems of self love, independence, and moving on, with artists building careers around narratives of thriving alone. Book publishing sees surges in titles offering guidance on single living, financial autonomy for women, Stoic philosophy for men, and critiques of modern relational expectations. The cultural output mirrors the lived experience. Fewer stories assume partnership as the endpoint, more portray it as optional or even burdensome. Health outcomes begin to diverge in measurable ways as well. Longitudinal studies tracking cohorts over decades show that never married men who maintain active social networks through male friendships, family ties, or community involvement often experience mortality and morbidity rates comparable to or better than their married counterparts, particularly when they avoid high conflict relationships. The protective effect, once attributed almost exclusively to marriage, appears tied more to social connection in general than to romantic partnership specifically. For women, the picture is more complex. Those who remain unpartnered into middle age sometimes report elevated risks for certain stress related conditions, potentially linked to financial strain, caregiving burdens without spousal support, or the cumulative weight of unmet expectations around companionship. Public health campaigns increasingly address loneliness as a standalone risk factor, yet interventions remain limited in scope and rarely tackle the gender specific drivers of disconnection. Legal and policy landscapes feel the pressure too. Family courts handle fewer divorce filings as marriage rates fall, but existing caseloads remain backlogged with high conflict separations that shape perceptions of risk for younger generations. Legislative efforts to reform alimony, custody presumptions, and asset division gain traction in some jurisdictions, driven by advocacy groups highlighting perceived imbalances. At the same time, movements pushing for stronger protections against domestic abuse and workplace harassment maintain momentum, creating a tension between addressing genuine harms and avoiding overcorrections that further deter male participation in relational or professional spheres. Balancing these priorities proves politically challenging, with reforms often stalling amid polarized debate. Religious institutions confront parallel declines. Attendance at traditional services has dropped across denominations, particularly among younger adults who view organized religion as incompatible with modern individualism or who associate it with outdated gender roles. Some congregations respond by emphasizing community service, personal spirituality, or inclusive programming that downplays marriage and family as central goals. Others double down on traditional teachings, attracting smaller but more committed memberships. The overall trend points toward a secularizing society where spiritual fulfillment increasingly occurs outside institutional frameworks, often through individualized practices or online communities. Technological innovation continues to accelerate these shifts. Virtual reality environments offer immersive social spaces where users interact through avatars, reducing the physical and emotional risks of real world engagement. Artificial companions, chatbots, voice assistants, holographic projections provide conversation, affirmation, and simulated intimacy without reciprocity demands. Dating platforms experiment with AI matchmaking that promises compatibility based on deeper personality profiling, yet user retention remains low as skepticism about algorithmic fairness persists. Social media evolves toward niche, interest based groups that foster connection without romantic pressure, allowing people to build identity and belonging around hobbies rather than relationship status. In this evolving landscape, the concept of success itself undergoes redefinition. Traditional markers, marriage, home ownership, children, career ladder, lose universal appeal as individuals craft alternative hierarchies of value. For many men, success now means financial independence, of physical vitality, intellectual freedom, and freedom from obligation. For many women, it centers on career achievement, personal style, travel, and unbreakable friendships. Both definitions prioritize self-determination over interdependence, reflecting a broader cultural pivot toward autonomy as the highest good. This pivot carries both liberating and sobering dimensions. On one hand, people escape relationships that once trapped them in mismatched roles or unfulfilling dynamics. On the other, society loses the stabilizing force that widespread family formation once provided: intergenerational continuity, mutual aid networks, shared responsibility for the young and the old. The trade off unfolds slowly, with costs and benefits distributed unevenly across generations, classes, and geographies. Looking ahead, the most plausible trajectory involves further institutional adaptation rather than sudden reversal. Schools may expand life skills curricula to include financial literacy, emotional resilience, and solo living strategies. Employers could formalize mentorship and networking in ways that minimize risk while preserving opportunity. Cultural narratives may gradually normalize lifelong singlehood as a valid and fulfilling path, reducing the stigma that once attached to it. Yet, beneath these adaptations lies the persistent question of whether humans can sustain social cohesion when the primary bond between genders weakens so dramatically. The withdrawal that began as a quiet individual choice has become a collective phenomenon, reshaping expectations, economies, and institutions. Men continue building lives of purpose and peace on their own terms. Women forge meaning through achievement and sisterhood amid the absence of partnership. Both navigate a world forever changed by the realization that the old contract no longer holds persuasive power for enough people to sustain it. The future will be written in the space between these two realities, where solitude meets resilience, independence meets longing, and society searches for new forms of connection that honor the lessons of the present without repeating the mistakes of the past. The quiet accumulation of these changes eventually forces a broader reconsideration of what community itself means in an era where cross gender trust has eroded so deeply. Neighborhoods that once buzzed with casual exchanges between families now feel more compartmentalized, with people retreating into private routines or tightly curated social bubbles. Block associations struggle to recruit volunteers for events that require mixed participation, settling instead for low effort activities like online fundraisers or single gender cleanup crews. Local sports leagues that historically served as informal matchmaking grounds see enrollment tilt heavily toward one gender or the other, with co ed divisions shrinking year after year as organizers report fewer signups from men wary of misinterpretation and women preferring all female teams for comfort and camaraderie. The loss is subtle but cumulative: fewer shared memories, fewer overlapping social circles, fewer opportunities for the kind of repeated low stakes contact that once allowed familiarity and attraction to develop naturally over months or years. Schools and universities mirror this separation in their own ways. Campus life has shifted noticeably toward gender segregated social patterns. Study groups, club meetings, and residence hall events increasingly form along same sex lines, not always by explicit rule, but by organic preference. Mixed gender dorm floors or housing arrangements, once standard, now prompt more requests for single sex options or private rooms as students cite comfort and reduce tension. Greek life organizations, where they still exist, often reinforce these divides through events that cater primarily to one gender or host heavily structured interactions designed to minimize ambiguity. Faculty and administrators notice the change in classroom dynamics as well: fewer spontaneous debates between male and female students, more cautious participation from men in discussions touching on gender topics, and a general flattening of intellectual friction that once sparked growth through challenge and differing perspectives. The academic environment becomes more polite on the surface, but less dynamic underneath, with ideas circulating in echo chambers rather than through open contest. This institutional drift extends into civic life. Voter turnout patterns among never married adults show increasing divergence from married cohorts, with singles more likely to prioritize issues of personal autonomy, economic self sufficiency, and skepticism toward family oriented policies. Political messaging adapts accordingly. Campaigns targeting younger demographics emphasize individual rights, financial independence, housing affordability for single occupants, and protections against perceived overreach in personal relationships rather than traditional appeals to family values or generational continuity. Parties that once built platforms around strengthening marriage and parenthood now face declining resonance among large segments of the electorate, forcing strategists to recalibrate language and priorities toward themes of empowerment and choice that resonate more strongly with the growing single population. The labor market feels these shifts in hiring practices and workplace culture. Companies that rely on the collaborative teams notice higher turnover among young men who perceive advancement paths as overly tied to performative social skills or emotional labor they no longer wish to provide. Recruitment efforts pivot toward emphasizing flexibility, remote options, clear boundaries, and merit based progression to attract talent that values autonomy over camaraderie. Human resources departments expand training on interpersonal conduct while simultaneously shortening onboarding periods and reducing mandatory team building exercises that once forced mingling. The result is a more efficient but less cohesive professional environment where loyalty ties to compensation and mission rather than to colleagues or shared experiences. Long term career trajectories change shape as well. Men increasingly opt for lateral moves, contract work, or entrepreneurial ventures that allow them to control their time and exposure, rather than climbing hierarchical ladders that demand constant visibility and relational investment. Women in the workforce navigate a different set of pressures. Many continue advancing into leadership roles at higher rates than previous generations, yet they encounter a shrinking pool of male peers willing to form professional alliances that extend beyond the minimum required. Mentorship relationships become more formal or same gender, limiting exposure to diverse strategic perspectives that once came from cross gender collaboration. Promotion decisions sometimes reflect this isolation, with women needing to build stronger internal networks to compensate for the absence of informal sponsorship from male superiors who have grown more guarded. The overall effect is a workplace that functions smoothly on paper, but lacks the organic synergy that historically drove breakthroughs and loyalty. Public spaces themselves undergo a perceptible cooling. Cafes, bars, bookstores, gyms, and parks that once served as default third places for casual interaction now host more solitary visitors or same gender groups. Men often choose off peak hours or quieter corners to avoid unwanted attention or simply to enjoy solitude without explanation. Women cluster with friends for safety and social energy, creating visible barriers that discourage outsiders from approaching. The ambient level of friendliness declines as people default to headphones, screens, or averted gazes rather than risk miscommunication. Urban planners respond by designing more private seating arrangements, individual workstations in public libraries, and single occupancy pods in co working cafes, effectively institutionalizing the preference for separation. Transportation patterns shift in tandem. Ride sharing data shows increasing numbers of solo trips rather than shared rides among friends or dates. Public transit ridership among young adults stagnates or declines in favor of if personal vehicles, bikes, or walking routes that allow greater control over interactions. Commuting becomes another domain of minimized contact, with people choosing longer but more isolated paths to preserve mental space. Even air travel reflects the trend. Fewer couples booking joint vacations, more individuals purchasing solo tickets for conferences, retreats, or leisure, and airlines expanding premium economy and business class offerings tailored to single travelers who value privacy over cost savings from shared seating. The food and hospitality industries adjust their footprints accordingly. Restaurant chains downsize table configurations, replacing large booths with smaller two tops and high top singles that accommodate solo diners comfortably. Menu engineering favors shareable small plates less often, shifting toward individual entrees and personalized experiences. Delivery services see explosive growth in single portion packaging, with meal kit companies offering streamlined plans for one that emphasize convenience and self sufficiency. Bars and lounges experiment with concepts like no talking sections, silent reading nights, or individual listening stations to cater to patrons who arrive alone and intend to leave alone. Fitness and wellness sectors thrive on this cultural pivot. Gym memberships among men surge for strength training, combat sports, and outdoor endurance activities that offer physical challenge without social obligation. Women dominate classes focused on community, empowerment, and aesthetic goals. Yoga, Pilates, dance cardio, where instructors build followings around themes of self care and female solidarity. Cross training spaces that once mixed genders freely now segment offerings or create separate peak hour schedules to reduce friction. Personal trainers report clients seeking programs that maximize individual progress while minimizing group interaction, reflecting a broader desire to improve the self without entanglement. Mental health services expand rapidly to address the loneliness that accompanies widespread independence. Therapists note rising caseloads of clients grappling with prolonged singlehood, though the presenting complaints differ markedly by gender. Men often arrive seeking tools for managing isolation without romantic involvement, building routines that sustain long term contentment, or processing resentment from past experiences. Women more frequently present with anxiety around aging alone, grief over missed relational windows, or frustration with the perceived unavailability of emotionally available partners. Treatment modalities adapt. Group therapy splits along gender lines more often. Online support communities proliferate in single gender formats, and self help literature divides into tracks emphasizing stoic resilience for men and relational healing for women. The creative arts capture this moment with particular clarity. Novelists explore protagonists who choose solitude after relational disillusionment, finding unexpected richness in disciplined routines and private passions. Filmmakers produce character studies of individuals navigating middle age alone, portraying both the freedom and the quiet ache of independence. Visual artists experiment with themes of separation, empty chairs at tables set for two, mirrored reflections without companions, vast landscapes inhabited by solitary figures. Music continues its evolution toward introspective anthems that celebrate self mastery over partnership, with genres from hip hop to indie folk producing tracks that frame solitude as victory rather than tragedy. Scientific research begins to quantify the long term physiological effects of these lifestyle choices. Studies tracking biomarkers of stress, inflammation, and cardiovascular health find that men who maintain purposeful routines, physical activity, and limited but meaningful social ties often show resilience comparable to partnered individuals, challenging earlier assumptions that marriage conferred unique protective benefits. For women, research highlights greater variability. Those with strong platonic networks and financial stability fare well, while those facing economic precarity or unresolved relational disappointment exhibit elevated cortisol patterns and sleep disruption. Neuroimaging work reveals differences in brain activity related to reward processing, with solitary individuals showing heightened activation from personal achievements and mastery experiences rather than interpersonal bonding. These findings feed back into public discourse, where commentators debate whether society should accept permanent singlehood as the new equilibrium or attempt active interventions to restore balance. Proposals range from mandatory social skills, education in schools, to tax structures that reward joint filing without penalizing independence. From public campaigns normalizing friendship as primary emotional support to incentives for mixed gender community service. Most efforts remain small scale or symbolic, however, because the underlying incentives that drove the withdrawal remain largely unchanged. The deeper truth emerging from all these layers is that the current arrangement, however uncomfortable for some, has achieved a kind of stability through mutual non engagement. Men preserve their peace by minimizing exposure to perceived risk. Women protect their dignity and energy by redirecting it toward reliable sources of affirmation. Society reorganizes around these preferences, creating parallel tracks of living that intersect less frequently and less consequentially than before. The friction that once fueled both conflict and connection has been largely engineered away, leaving a quieter, more predictable world where individuals chart their own courses with fewer collisions. Whether this equilibrium proves durable over generations remains an open question. Children raised primarily in single parent or single adult households develop different expectations around intimacy, provision, and interdependence. Early data suggest they prioritize autonomy even more strongly, viewing romantic partnership as optional rather than aspirational. If the pattern holds, future cohorts may regard the current moment as the transition point where society fully decoupled personal fulfillment from relational obligation, accepting solitude not as a problem to solve, but as a legitimate endpoint. For now, the trajectory continues. Men deepen their commitment to self directed lives built on discipline, competence, and selective connection. Women strengthen bonds within sisterhoods that provide emotional scaffolding in the absence of romantic scaffolding. Both groups adapt institutions, economies, and cultures to accommodate the reality they have collectively created. The result is a civilization learning to function with far less reliance on the traditional pairing of men and women, discovering new ways to sustain meaning, productivity, and care while grappling with the voids that remain. The long term demographic consequences begin to crystallize when projections extend beyond the current generation into the grandchildren of today's young adults. Statistical models from national bureaus and academic institutes forecast that by the 2050s and 2060s, the proportion of adults who have never entered a long term cohabiting or marital partnership could stabilize at levels 2 to 3 times higher than those observed in the mid 20th century. This stabilization would not occur because romantic connection suddenly rebounds, but because successive cohorts inherit and amplify the preference for autonomy. Children growing up primarily in single adult households or with one custodial parent and limited contact with the other develop schemas around relationships that emphasize personal boundaries, financial self reliance, and emotional self regulation far more than interdependence. Early observational studies of adolescents in these environments show them expressing lower expectations for lifelong partnership, viewing it as one lifestyle option among many rather than a default milestone. They report greater comfort with the idea of remaining unpartnered into their 30s and 40s, often citing examples from their own parents or older siblings who appear content without spouses. This attitudinal shift feeds directly into fertility patterns that are already well below replacement in most developed economies. The average number of children per woman continues to hover between 1.3 and 1.7 in many Western nations, with some urban centers dipping closer to 1.0 when adjusted for native born populations. The decision to have fewer children or none at all stems less from economic hardship alone and more from a rational assessment that raising offspring without a committed co parent increases personal strain exponentially. Single mothers, who still constitute the majority of solo parents, face documented challenges in balancing career progression, childcare logistics, and personal well being, while single fathers remain a smaller but growing demographic that often opts for different paths, such as shared custody or remaining child free after separation. The cumulative effect is a society aging more rapidly than at any point in modern history, with dependency ratios climbing as fewer working age adults support larger cohorts of retirees through taxes, pensions, and healthcare systems. Pension and Social Security frameworks feel this pressure acutely. Actuaries revise long term solvency projections downward as contribution bases shrink relative to benefit recipients. Governments respond with incremental adjustments, raising retirement ages, means testing benefits, encouraging private savings vehicles, but these measures address symptoms rather than the structural decline in family based intergenerational transfer. In cultures where adult children traditionally cared for elderly parents, the expectation weakens as fewer offspring exist, and those who do prioritize their own independence. Nursing home occupancy rises steadily. Elder care industries expand to fill gaps once covered by kin networks, and public discourse begins to grapple with the ethics of state supported longevity in a context of shrinking tax paying populations. Immigration emerges as one partial counterbalance, with receiving countries relying more heavily on newcomers to sustain workforce size and cultural vitality. Yet, integration patterns show that second generation immigrants often adopt the same low fertility, high autonomy behaviors as native populations within one or two generations, particularly in urban settings. The demographic dividend provided by migration therefore proves temporary, unless accompanied by deliberate policies that encourage family formation across groups, policies that face resistance when large segments of the electorate view partnership incentives as coercive or outdated. Environmental and resource dynamics intersect with these trends in unexpected ways. Lower household formation reduces aggregate demand for new residential construction, easing pressure on land use, water systems, and energy grids in some regions. Smaller average household sizes correlate with per capita increases in consumption of certain goods. More appliances, more vehicles per adult, more packaging waste from individual portioning. But overall, ecological footprints can shrink when fewer children are born and lifestyles trend toward minimalism. Climate policy discussions occasionally highlight these side effects, with some analysts arguing that sustained subreplacement fertility represents an unintentional brake on global population growth, while others caution that aging societies may lack the innovative capacity and labor flexibility needed to implement rapid decarbonization or adaptation measures. Technological responses to demographic contraction accelerate in parallel. Robotics and automation fill gaps in elder care, with companion robots providing basic monitoring, medication reminders, and conversational engagement for seniors living alone. Artificial intelligence systems evolve to offer more sophisticated forms of simulated companionship, from voice interfaces that remember personal histories and preferences to virtual reality environments where users maintain long term relationships with algorithmic entities designed to adapt and evolve. Adoption rates climb fastest among older cohorts facing isolation and younger cohorts already accustomed to digital first interaction. Ethical debates intensify around whether such technologies substitute adequately for human connection or merely postpone the societal reckoning with widespread solitude. Economic theory begins to incorporate these realities more explicitly. Traditional models assuming stable family units as the core consumption and production cell give way to frameworks built around individual utility maximization over extended lifespans. Labor economists document a solitude premium in certain occupations, higher wages, or better retention in roles offering remote work, flexible hours, and minimal interpersonal demands, reflecting the market's response to worker preferences. Consumer price indices start to weight single occupant baskets more heavily, capturing shifts toward products optimized for one person rather than shared households. Wealth inequality patterns evolve as well. Individuals who accumulate assets early and avoid costly relational entanglements often achieve greater net worth over time, widening gaps between those who remain single by choice and those who remain single by circumstance. Cultural memory itself transforms. Historical narratives that once celebrated marriage, parenthood, and multi generational households as markers of personal and civic virtue lose centrality in education and media. Textbooks and documentaries devote more space to movements for individual rights, technological progress, and self actualization, framing earlier eras of near universal family formation as products of economic necessity or social control rather than inherent human aspiration. Popular history podcasts and streaming series explore the lives of historical figures who remained unpartnered or childless, presenting their paths as equally valid contributions to art, science, philosophy, or public service. The collective story society tells itself shifts from one centered on lineage and legacy through descendants toward one emphasizing personal impact, intellectual inheritance, and cultural artifacts that endure beyond biological continuity. Artistic expression continues to probe these new emotional landscapes. Playwrights stage works in which characters confront the quiet terror of outliving their social world, finding redemption not in reunion, but in disciplined acceptance of impermanence. Poets craft sequences that meditate on the texture of days unmarked by shared rituals. Coffee brewed for one, holidays observed in solitude, anniversaries that pass unnoticed. Visual artists install pieces that juxtapose empty domestic spaces with objects of intense personal significance. A single chair pulled close to a window, a shelf of well thumbed books, a wall covered in photographs of places visited alone. The aesthetic of solitude gains legitimacy, moving from marginal subculture to mainstream motif as galleries and museums curate exhibitions around themes of autonomy and interiority. Literary nonfiction proliferates with memoirs and essays written by midlife singles who chronicle the gradual construction of meaningful existence outside partnership. Authors describe the liberation of designing days around personal rhythms, the unexpected depth of friendship sustained over decades, the satisfaction of mastering skills pursued purely for intrinsic reward. These accounts rarely romanticize isolation. Instead, they confront its limitations candidly. Moments of acute loneliness during illness, the absence of a default confidant during crises, the knowledge that certain experiences will remain unlived, while arguing that the trade offs favor sovereignty over compromise. Readers encounter these texts not as cautionary tales, but as blueprints, helping normalize a trajectory that once carried heavier stigma. Scientific inquiry into human bonding mechanisms deepens in response. Researchers map neural pathways associated with different forms of attachment: romantic, platonic, familial, self directed, seeking to understand why some individuals thrive in solitude while others experience it as deprivation. Longitudinal neuroimaging studies track changes in brain structure and function among adults who remain unpartnered over 10 or 20-year periods, identifying compensatory mechanisms in regions tied to self-referential processing, reward from mastery, and regulation of stress through routine. Findings suggest that the capacity for self-soothing and intrinsic motivation can strengthen significantly when external relational inputs remain low, offering a biological basis for the reported life satisfaction among many voluntarily single men and some women who redirect energy successfully. Public health frameworks evolve to reflect this emerging reality. Campaigns once focused almost exclusively on couple based wellness, date nights for stress reduction, joint exercise goals, shift toward promoting robust solo strategies, structured daily movement, consistent sleep hygiene, financial planning for longevity, and intentional cultivation of non romantic support networks. Mental health professionals develop specialized protocols for addressing prolonged singlehood without pathologizing it, distinguishing between adaptive independence and maladaptive withdrawal. Community programs experiment with hybrid models, co housing arrangements that provide proximity without obligation, interest based collectives that meet regularly but preserve personal space, digital platforms that facilitate low commitment companionship around shared pursuits. The philosophical implications ripple outward. Thinkers revisit classical questions about the good life in light of contemporary evidence. Aristotle's emphasis on friendship as essential to flourishing receives renewed scrutiny, with some arguing that modern Platonic bonds fulfill the same function once reserved for marriage. Stoic principles gain broader appeal as practical guides for maintaining equanimity amid relational scarcity. Existentialist reflections on authenticity and self creation resonate more deeply when partnership no longer serves as the primary arena for defining identity. Contemporary ethicists debate whether society has a collective obligation to foster conditions for pair bonding or whether respecting individual preference for solitude represents the higher moral ground. In practice, the balance tips toward the latter. Policy remains cautious about direct intervention in private choices, favoring indirect supports, affordable housing options suitable for singles, universal basic services that reduce economic pressure to partner for survival, expanded leave policies that apply equally to caregiving for friends or chosen family. The cultural consensus coalesces around a pluralistic vision. Partnership remains available for those who seek it, but no longer functions as the presumed telos of adult development. And this vision carries its own quiet power. It acknowledges that humans can construct meaning through multiple channels: creative output, intellectual contribution, service to strangers, stewardship of place, devotion to craft, without requiring the presence of a romantic counterpart. It recognizes that the capacity for love and care does not vanish when directed inward or toward non exclusive bonds. It simply takes different forms. And it accepts that a society composed of more solitary individuals can still cohere around shared institutions, mutual respect for boundaries, and a common recognition that each person's path deserves space to unfold. The transition remains uneven, marked by moments of friction and pockets of resistance. Yet the direction holds steady. Men continue refining lives of disciplined freedom. Women sustain networks of mutual uplift. Institutions bend to accommodate the new majority reality. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the collective imagination expands to encompass a wider range of legitimate ways to be human, ways that no longer hinge on the successful negotiation of romantic partnership, but on the steady, deliberate creation of a life that feels true. The philosophical reorientation that accompanies this widespread acceptance of solitary living eventually reshapes foundational questions about human purpose and legacy. Traditional Western thought often positioned reproduction and familial continuity as central to a meaningful existence, drawing from religious, evolutionary, and cultural premises that viewed descendants as the primary vehicle for extending influence across time. As singlehood solidifies into a statistically dominant trajectory for large segments of the population, those older assumptions lose their prescriptive force. People increasingly locate legacy in non biological channels. The dissemination of ideas through writing, teaching, open source contributions, or public advocacy. The creation of enduring art, music, architecture, or design. The stewardship of land, community projects, or environmental restoration efforts. The mentorship of unrelated younger individuals through professional networks or volunteer programs. These forms of inheritance require no genetic link, yet carry the potential to ripple outward for generations, offering a broader and more inclusive definition of what it means to leave something behind. This expanded understanding of legacy finds concrete expression in the rise of intentional communities built around shared values rather than kinship. Groups form around permaculture farms, artist residencies, hacker collectives, philosophical retreats, or skill sharing cooperatives where participants commit to long term collaboration without romantic or familial obligations. These arrangements provide many of the practical benefits once associated with marriage: mutual aid during illness, pooled resources for major purchases, emotional support during hardship, while preserving individual sovereignty over personal space, finances, and life decisions. Participants report higher satisfaction than in conventional households when the structure explicitly rejects hierarchical gender roles or lifelong exclusivity. The model spreads gradually through online forums, regional meetups, and documentary coverage, attracting people disillusioned with both traditional family life and pure isolation. Over time, such communities begin to function as quasi familial units in the eyes of local governments, gaining access to certain zoning variances, cooperative insurance pools, or tax treatments previously reserved for blood related households. Legal recognition of these new social forms lags but inches forward. Some jurisdictions introduce frameworks for chosen family registrations that confer limited rights: hospital visitation, inheritance priority in the absence of a will, decision making authority during incapacity, without requiring marriage or cohabitation. Advocacy organizations push for broader reforms, arguing that outdated statutes penalize adults who build support networks outside romantic partnership. Courts in progressive regions occasionally uphold such arrangements through creative interpretation of existing contract or trust law, allowing individuals to designate non relatives as primary beneficiaries or fiduciaries. The slow evolution reflects a deeper societal negotiation: how to extend protections historically tied to marriage without diluting their meaning or creating new inequalities. Education systems adapt their curricula to prepare students for this emerging landscape. High school and college programs increasingly include modules on personal finance tailored to lifelong singlehood, retirement planning without spousal social security benefits, estate planning without default heirs, insurance strategies for solo risks. Life skills courses cover home maintenance, emotional self regulation, boundary setting in friendships, and strategies for aging in place without children nearby. Sex education shifts emphasis from relational negotiation towards consent, personal agency, and the optionality of partnership. Guidance counselors receive training to support students who express little interest in dating or family formation, helping them map fulfilling trajectories that center on vocation, creativity, travel, or civic engagement rather than defaulting to couple centric milestones. Corporate human resources policies evolve in response to the changing composition of the workforce. Benefits packages expand to include mental health days without requiring justification tied to family obligations, fertility preservation coverage decoupled from partnership status, and flexible leave for caregiving of chosen family or community members. Performance review criteria place greater weight on individual output and less on team bonding metrics that implicitly favor extroverted or relationally oriented employees. Diversity initiatives begin to include relationship status diversity as a dimension, recognizing that single employees may face unique pressures around relocation, overtime expectations, or assumptions about availability. The goal is to reduce the subtle penalties that once accrued to those outside traditional family structures while maintaining fairness across the board. Media representation follows suit, with increasing numbers of protagonists whose arcs do not resolve through romantic union. Streaming series explore characters who reject coupling without villainizing it, portraying lives rich in purpose, humor, and connection, yet free of domestic partnership. News outlets produce long form features on thriving single communities, solo adventurers in their 70s, or professionals who credit prolonged independence for career breakthroughs that would have been impossible under family constraints. Advertising moves beyond token inclusions of single characters to campaigns built entirely around solitary fulfillment. Luxury brands showcasing one traveler in vast landscapes. Financial firms highlighting wealth accumulation unencumbered by joint decisions. Wellness companies promoting routines designed for personal sovereignty. The cultural mirror reflects a reality in which partnership appears as one valid choice among many, no longer the inevitable happy ending. Scientific understanding of aging in solitary contexts matures through dedicated longitudinal cohorts. Researchers follow thousands of adults who entered midlife unpartnered, tracking physical function, cognitive decline, social engagement, and subjective well being into their 80s and 90s. Preliminary findings indicate that those who maintain physical activity, intellectual stimulation, and at least moderate social ties, whether through friendships, community roles, or digital networks, exhibit trajectories comparable to married peers, while those who drift into extreme isolation show accelerated vulnerabilities. Interventions emerge that target the preventable subset of decline. Group exercise programs for seniors living alone, technology assisted medication adherence, neighborhood buddy systems that pair unrelated adults for mutual check ins. Public funding begins to flow toward these low cost, high impact models rather than assuming family caregivers will fill the gaps. Urban planning incorporates these demographic realities more deliberately. Cities revise master plans to prioritize density configurations that support solo living. Mid-rise buildings with small, efficient units clustered around communal green spaces, rooftop gardens, and ground floor co-working or maker spaces. Walkability and transit access gain priority over car-dependent suburban sprawl, recognizing that single adults rely more heavily on public infrastructure for mobility and social opportunity. Age-friendly design principles expand to include features that ease and independent aging, wider doorways for future mobility aids, lever handles, smart home integration for safety monitoring, and proximity to essential services. Developers market these projects not as retirement communities, but as lifetime neighborhoods suitable for every stage of autonomous adulthood. The global diffusion of these patterns accelerates through cultural exchange and economic convergence. Middle income countries that once maintained high marriage and fertility rates see urban youth adopting similar attitudes as educational attainment rises, housing costs soar, and digital media exposes them to Western models of individualism. Marriage ages climb, cohabitation without children becomes more common, and singlehood rates among 30 somethings in major Asian, Latin American, and Eastern European cities begin to mirror those in North America and Western Europe a decade earlier. International organizations adjust population forecasts accordingly, revising downward their estimates of peak global population and accelerating timelines for aging related fiscal strain in emerging economies. This convergence prompts renewed geopolitical reflection. Nations with persistently low fertility face strategic questions about military recruitment, innovation capacity, and diplomatic influence in a world where population size increasingly correlates with power projection. Some governments intensify natalist campaigns, extended parental leave, direct cash transfers per child, subsidized housing for young families. Yet results remain modest when young adults have internalized the risks and trade offs of parenthood in uncertain economic and relational environments. Others lean into selective immigration, automation, and extended working lives as primary responses, accepting demographic contraction as a manageable constraint rather than an existential crisis. Amid these macro shifts, individual narratives continue to accumulate evidence that solitary paths can sustain deep fulfillment across the lifespan. Diaries, letters, and oral histories preserved from previous eras of widespread singlehood, particularly among women in religious orders, career driven spinsters of the early 20th century, or men who chose lifelong bachelorhood, reveal recurring themes: intense focus on craft or service, rich inner worlds cultivated through reading and reflection, networks of affection built slowly and deliberately, and a sense of completeness derived from alignment between values and daily practice. Contemporary voices echo these patterns, describing the relief of waking each day without negotiation, the freedom to redirect energy toward causes or creations larger than personal romance, and the quiet pride of building resilience against life's inevitable losses. The cumulative weight of these stories gradually erodes the lingering cultural assumption that unpartnered life represents a diminished or incomplete state. Public intellectuals articulate frameworks that place self relation at the center of flourishing, arguing that the capacity to meet one's own emotional and practical needs constitutes the foundation upon which all other bonds rest. When that foundation proves sturdy, external relationships, whether friendships, mentorships, or casual alliances, can form from abundance rather than necessity, reducing the likelihood of codependency or resentment. This perspective gains traction in self development literature, therapy modalities, and even corporate leadership training, where emotional sovereignty emerges as a prerequisite for effective collaboration. By the middle decades of the century, the societal architecture has largely adjusted to the reality of widespread voluntary singlehood. Housing stock, transportation networks, healthcare delivery, educational content, workplace norms, legal protections, artistic production, and philosophical discourse all reflect the centrality of individual agency over collective domesticity. The transition carries losses. Fewer spontaneous intergenerational households, Quieter streets on holidays once filled with family gatherings, slower population replacement in many regions, but it also yields gains, greater personal latitude, reduced relational conflict, expanded definitions of contribution and legacy, and a cultural atmosphere that honors diverse paths without ranking them hierarchically. The equilibrium feels neither utopian nor dystopian. It simply is. Men sustain lives of clarity and purpose through discipline independence. Women nurture strength through chosen connections and self mastery. Society persists, reconfigured around the simple recognition that not every human story needs to converge on partnership to matter. The old certainties fade, replaced by a broader canvas where meaning arises from the steady accumulation of deliberate choices wherever those choices lead. The acceptance of solitary living as a legitimate and often preferable mode of existence gradually reshapes the moral imagination of entire generations. Ethical frameworks that once measured personal virtue largely through duties to spouse, children, and extended kin begin to accommodate a wider spectrum of obligations. Duty now includes rigorous self care as a prerequisite for contributing meaningfully to others. Stewardship of one's own mind and body becomes a moral imperative rather than a selfish indulgence. Responsibility extends outward to chosen communities, causes, institutions, or even abstract future generations through carbon reduction, knowledge preservation, or policy influence. The old hierarchy that placed biological family at the apex softens into a flatter landscape where impact is judged by scale and sincerity rather than proximity or blood tie. Moral philosophers publish treatises arguing that intentional childlessness or permanent singlehood can represent a form of sacrifice when the decision stems from honest assessment of one's capacity to parent well or partner equitably, freeing resources and attention for broader service. This moral reweighting influences philanthropy and civic participation in measurable ways. Charitable giving among never married adults in their 40s and 50s often outpaces that of their married peers when adjusted for income, with donations directed toward causes that reflect personal values rather than family oriented priorities. Volunteer hours concentrate in areas such as literacy programs, animal welfare, environmental restoration, refugee resettlement, and suicide prevention hotlines, fields where impact feels direct and where the giver remains unencumbered by competing domestic claims. Political activism follows a similar pattern. Single individuals show higher rates of protest attendance, petition signing, and campaign volunteering, particularly on issues of economic justice, climate action, digital privacy, and institutional reform. The absence of a partner or children to protect from fallout allows greater willingness to accept personal risk for collective gain. Religious and spiritual communities undergo their own quiet metamorphosis. Congregations that once oriented programs around marriage preparation, parenting workshops, and couple retreats now emphasize contemplative practices, service missions, and study groups open to all life stages. Monastic traditions, both Christian and secular equivalents, experience renewed interest among midlife seekers who view vows of celibacy or simplicity less as renunciation and more as liberation from relational complexity. New spiritual movements emerge around themes of radical self responsibility, non dual awareness, and ecological kinship, attracting participants who find traditional theologies too entangled with procreative assumptions. Online sanghas, meditation retreats, and philosophy circles provide communal belonging without requiring physical cohabitation or lifelong commitment, offering a scalable alternative to both isolation and conventional family life. The world of work continues its adaptation in finer grained ways. Remote and hybrid arrangements become permanent fixtures rather than pandemic era anomalies, with companies competing to offer the most generous autonomy packages. Unlimited personal time allowances, results only work environments, sabbatical options decoupled from tenure, and mental health stipends that fund therapy, coaching, or solo travel. Job descriptions increasingly highlight low drama culture and respect for personal boundaries as selling points, signaling awareness that many candidates prioritize peace over prestige. Promotion pathways diversify with parallel tracks for those who excel in individual contributor roles rather than people management positions that demand constant emotional labor. The gig and creator economies mature into viable long term career structures, supported by portable benefits platforms that pool health coverage, retirement contributions, and income insurance across independent workers. Entrepreneurship among singles surges as a natural extension of self reliance. Founders launch ventures in niches tailored to solitary lifestyles, subscription boxes for premium solo cooking ingredients, apps that gamify habit formation without social comparison features, modular furniture systems designed for small footprint apartments, virtual companionship services that blend AI and human moderation, and financial tools that optimize wealth building for one person estates. These businesses often achieve rapid scale because their creators understand the audience intimately, having lived the pain points themselves. Venture capital flows disproportionately toward such ideas, recognizing that the growing single demographic represents an underserved yet loyal market segment. Consumer technology evolves to serve this reality with increasing precision. Smart home ecosystems add features for solo occupants, automated lighting sequences that simulate presence during travel, voice assistants trained to detect falls or prolonged inactivity without requiring wearable monitoring, refrigerators that suggest recipes scaled to one with minimal waste, and security systems that integrate seamlessly with pet cameras or plant sensors rather than family schedules. Wearables refine sleep and stress tracking to provide actionable insights for individuals managing their own circadian rhythms without a partner's influence. Dating apps, while still dominant, lose cultural centrality as alternatives gain traction. Platforms focused on platonic companionship, skill sharing meetups, or temporary co living arrangements that carry no romantic expectation. The language itself begins to shift in subtle but persistent ways. Terms once laden with judgment, spinster, confirmed bachelor, old maid, vanish from everyday speech, replaced by neutral or positive descriptors. Solo by design, intentionally unpartnered, self partnered, autonomous adult. Wedding announcements no longer dominate social feeds. Instead, people celebrate major solo milestones, completing a decade long book project, summiting a major peak, achieving financial independence with equal fanfare. Condolence messages evolve to acknowledge different forms of loss. The death of a lifelong friend carries weight comparable to that of a spouse, and sympathy notes reflect awareness that chosen family can constitute one's primary emotional world. Healthcare delivery systems recalibrate to serve aging singles more effectively. Geriatric care teams expand to include social workers who help construct support webs when blood relatives are absent or distant. Home visit nursing services bundle routine checkups with companionship hours funded through public or private insurance. Preventive medicine programs emphasize social prescription initiatives, referrals to community choirs, gardening clubs, or debate societies, recognizing that consistent low-intensity contact buffers against decline more reliably than sporadic family visits. End-of-life planning gains prominence earlier in adulthood, with workshops teaching individuals how to draft advanced directives, designate healthcare proxies from non-kin networks, and prearrange funeral preferences so decisions do not fall to estranged relatives or overburdened friends. The arts deepen their exploration of solitary interiority. Novelists experiment with narrative structures that follow a single consciousness across decades without introducing a love interest as plot engine, relying instead on memory, observation, and subtle shifts in perception to sustain reader investment. Filmmakers produce slow cinema that lingers on everyday rituals performed alone: the precise folding of laundry, the measured preparation of tea, the late night editing of a personal archive, finding drama in the quiet assertion of continuity against entropy. Composers write chamber pieces for solo instruments that evoke the fullness of a life lived in self dialogue, using extended techniques to suggest inner multiplicity rather than external harmony. Dance works choreographed for individual performers explore themes of containment and release within private space, inviting audiences to witness movement that speaks to no one but the mover. Literary criticism develops new vocabularies to discuss these works without falling back on deficit models. Scholars analyze the poetics of solitude, tracing how silence, repetition, and minute detail can generate meaning as powerfully as conflict or union. Anthologies gather voices from across centuries who chose or were compelled to live apart, reframing their output not as compensation for missing partnership, but as evidence of alternative plenitude. University seminars on contemporary fiction devote entire terms to novels whose protagonists end exactly where they began: alone, reflective, and quietly whole. The cumulative effect of these changes is a society that has learned to metabolize solitude rather than pathologize it. Public health statistics begin to show stabilization in loneliness metrics among younger cohorts who never internalized coupledom as the measure of success. Mental health service utilization plateaus as preventive habits, regular exercise, creative practice, financial discipline, boundary maintenance become cultural defaults rather than therapeutic prescriptions. Suicide rates among middle aged singles decline in regions where community infrastructure supports non familial belonging, suggesting that the risk, once tied to isolation, owes more to lack of meaning than to lack of a partner. By the closing decades of the century, the transition appears largely complete. Marriage persists as a minority institution cherished by those who actively desire it. Childbearing concentrates among smaller, intentional groups supported by robust social safety nets. Most adults live as sovereign units connected through overlapping circles of affection, interest, and mutual aid. Economies, cities, technologies, laws, and stories have all bent to accommodate this configuration. The culture no longer waits for a great reconciliation between men and women. It has moved past the expectation that such a reconciliation is necessary for collective flourishing. What remains is a quieter resilience. Men walk their chosen roads with steady purpose, unburdened by obligations they no longer accept. Women cultivate strength in webs of their own weaving, unbound by negotiations that once drained them. Together, they inhabit a world that has learned to thrive with far less romantic entanglement than any previous era thought possible. The experiment continues day by day, choice by choice, proving that human beings can remake their social architecture when the old one no longer serves. And so, the story settles, not into despair, not into triumph, but into an unhurried acceptance of what is. The intensity of earlier decades fades into routine. The outrage cools into reflection. The hard-won peace spreads outward, one solitary life at a time, until solitude itself stops feeling like absence and begins to feel simply like presence. The transformation reaches its deepest layers when society begins to confront the question of what continuity looks like without the biological thread that once tied generations together so tightly. Legacy, stripped of the assumption that it must flow through children, starts to manifest in forms that feel almost alien to earlier eras, yet prove remarkably durable. People pour themselves into digital archives, personal wikis, curated video diaries, open repositories of family recipes rewritten for one, extensive photo collections annotated with context that future historians or curious descendants might one day stumble across. These acts of documentation become devotional practices, not for blood heirs, but for an abstract posterity, anyone who shares enough curiosity or circumstance to seek them out. Some individuals fund scholarships under their name with no strings attached beyond academic merit. Others endow community gardens, public benches inscribed with quiet maxims, or seed libraries that distribute heirloom varieties long after the planter has gone. The impulse to matter endures, redirected through channels that require no reciprocity during one's lifetime. This redirection reshapes how people measure time itself. Without the natural punctuation marks provided by weddings, births, school graduations, or grandchildren's milestones, life's rhythm shifts towards self imposed markers. Annual retreats become sacred, not as escapes, but as deliberate reckonings. Days spent reviewing journals, updating life inventories, adjusting long term goals with the same seriousness once reserved for family budget meetings. Birthdays evolve from celebrations of aging to audits of alignment, how closely the past 12 months matched declared values, how many small systems were refined, how much unnecessary friction was removed. Death itself loses some of its terror for those who have spent decades building internal coherence. The fear of being forgotten competes with the knowledge that fragments of one's mind, code committed to repositories, essays published in obscure journals, conversations preserved in chat logs, will persist in fragments long after the body stops. Friendship networks, now carrying far greater emotional weight, develop their own rituals and expectations. Long term platonic bonds acquire informal contracts, mutual aid pacts that outline who handles hospital advocacy, who manages digital passwords, who receives first notification of serious illness. These agreements, often drafted with the help of online templates or estate planning software, carry surprising emotional gravity because they rest on choice rather than obligation. People speak openly about primary friends the way earlier generations spoke of spouses, acknowledging that one or two individuals hold veto power over major decisions, access to deepest fears, permission to intervene when self neglect appears. The language borrows from kinship without apology, chosen sibling, life anchor, emergency contact of the heart. When these bonds fracture, the grief registers publicly and privately with an intensity once reserved for divorce or widowhood. The economic architecture supporting solitary adulthood matures into something almost elegant in its simplicity. Personal finance influencers who once preached couple oriented strategies, joint accounts, shared mortgages, dual income optimization, pivot to solo blueprints, aggressive index fund ladders, Roth conversion schedules timed to single life expectancy, real estate purchases structured around rental income rather than family expansion, insurance portfolios built around long term care riders, and umbrella policies that protect accumulated assets from liability claims. Retirement communities rebrand as autonomy villages, offering private cottages clustered around shared workshops, libraries, and dining halls where residents opt in or out of communal meals with equal dignity. The model proves profitable because it caters to people who have spent decades practicing self sufficiency and refuse to surrender it in old age. Healthcare innovation follows the same logic. Telemedicine platforms add dedicated solo aging tracks that bundle virtual primary care, mental health check ins, physical therapy sessions delivered via app guided routines, and prescription delivery drones for rural or mobility limited patients. Pharmaceutical companies develop longer acting formulations of common medications to reduce dosing frequency for people living without daily oversight. Assistive robotics advance beyond basic companionship into proactive care. Units that learn individual gait patterns to detect subtle changes signaling stroke risk. Refrigerators that flag nutritional deficiencies based on purchase history and voice reported symptoms. Mirrors embedded with subtle health scanners that track skin changes or pupil response over years. Adoption accelerates as cost curves bend downward, and younger cohorts, already comfortable with algorithmic assistance, view these tools as extensions of personal agency rather than replacements for absent humans. Urban and rural landscapes continue their parallel evolution. Cities densify around transit nodes with buildings engineered for lifetime adaptability. Units that convert from studio to one bedroom with movable partitions, kitchens designed for single cooks yet scalable for occasional guests, balconies fitted with hydroponic systems that supply fresh produce without requiring yard work. Suburbs retrofit older single family homes into accessory dwelling unit clusters, allowing aging owners to rent portions to younger singles who provide informal check ins in exchange for below market rent. Rural areas see the return of hamlet scale intentional settlements. Clusters of tiny homes or renovated barns linked by shared solar arrays, communal wells, and fiber optic trunks where residents maintain strict boundaries while benefiting from pooled equipment and emergency response protocols. Global migration flows adjust to the new demographic math. Countries facing acute population contraction, Japan, South Korea, Italy, parts of Eastern Europe, intensify recruitment of skilled workers who arrive single and remain so, offering fast track citizenship paths contingent on long term economic contribution rather than family reunification. Receiving nations in North America, Australia, and Northern Europe shift immigration criteria toward applicants with demonstrated self sufficiency, viewing them as lower fiscal risk than family units that may require extended social support. The result is a slow homogenization of urban professional classes across continents. Highly educated, unpartnered adults who cluster in similar neighborhoods, speak similar professional dialects, and sustain similar minimalist lifestyles regardless of passport. Cultural production keeps pace with the lived reality. Television formats experiment with ensemble casts whose relationships remain strictly platonic across seasons, finding tension in professional rivalries, ideological clashes, and personal growth arcs rather than romantic will they won't they threads. Podcasts proliferate in the solo life genre, hosting long form interviews with people who have spent 30 or 40 years unpartnered. Scientists who credit solitude for paradigm shifting discoveries. Chefs who built Michelin starred restaurants on the back of obsessive single minded practice. Activists whose lifelong campaigns would have collapsed under family demands. Listeners treat these conversations as secular sermons, proof that depth and impact do not require a plus one. Literary prizes begin to honor works that center solitary consciousness without apology or explanation. A novel narrated entirely in the second person, addressing the reader as a lifelong solo dweller, wins major awards for its unflinching portrait of internal weather, days of crystalline focus followed by weeks of low-grade melancholy that resolve through routine rather than rescue. A memoir composed of dated entries spanning 5 decades, each entry refusing to mention romantic love, even in passing, becomes a quiet bestseller among readers who recognize their own trajectory in its pages. The critical establishment, once quick to diagnose loneliness as pathology, now debates the aesthetics of restraint, the power of omission, the ethical weight of refusing conventional narrative closure. By the time the 21st century's third decade gives way to the fourth, the pattern has hardened into infrastructure. Schools teach life design workshops where teenagers map possible futures that do not assume partnership or parenthood. Employers offer autonomy sabbaticals that let workers step away for 3 to 6 months to test drive long term solo living without career penalty. Municipalities run solo preparedness fairs where attendees learn estate planning, home retrofitting, digital legacy management, and community building strategies, all framed as prudent adulthood rather than contingency planning for failure. The cultural conversation has moved past debate into quiet implementation. What emerges is neither collapse nor renaissance, but a steady state equilibrium sustained by millions of small, deliberate decisions. Men maintain their distance, content in the clarity that comes from refusing roles they no longer find reciprocal. Women lean into the reliability of female centered networks, finding in them a stability that romantic pursuit rarely delivered. Both groups, having exhausted the energy once spent on mismatched expectations, redirected toward private mastery and public contribution. Society, stripped of its old scaffolding, discovers it can stand on different supports: mutual respect for boundaries, appreciation for individual sovereignty, and a shared understanding that meaning need not arrive in pairs. The anger that once fueled viral threads and heated arguments cools into something closer to acceptance, not resignation, but recognition that the game changed irreversibly when enough players left the field. The data points no longer shock, they simply describe the present. The anecdotes no longer feel like outliers, they represent the norm. And the future, once imagined as a battleground between traditionalists and progressives, reveals itself as something quieter: a world where most adults walk alone, not because they hate company, but because company stopped feeling worth the compromise. Shout out to the 1 hour gang who powered through yet another marathon breakdown. If these raw, no filter, angry guy dissections are hitting the mark for you, show some love by grabbing me a Red Bull. Links down in the description. Hit the comments and tell me what part of this long arc landed heaviest. Are you seeing the same long term settling in your own circles? Do you buy that society can actually stabilize around mass singlehood without breaking? Lay it out. I read them all. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.